forum. We are holding this meeting on hybrid this afternoon, and we have some who are attending us on Starleaf. We have William, we have Ciara, and we have
Nicola.
Nicola, yeah, sorry Nicola, we have Nicola all on Starleaf. We have Joanne in the room here with ourselves, so we're going to proceed with the meeting today, and I want to confirm that all members in Starleaf can hear clearly enough, and if you have any questions during the proceeds of the meeting, then either raise your hand or make some noise in some way that we can hear and know that you want to you want to make an intervention. You can ask the clerk to inform the committee if any notice she's received of any members who has delegated authority to another member of the committee to vote on their behalf.
Carol has delegated to Nicola.
Okay, thank you for that. We have apologies from the chairperson and from Sinead Bradley at our meeting today. Agenda item 2 of the minutes, we have the draft minutes of the meeting of the 1st of December. At page 5 of our meeting pack, are members content to agree the minutes of the December meeting?
Yeah.
Agreement on same. Thank you for that. Agenda item 3 with matters arising, and members at page 13 of the pack. There is a memo from the clerk regarding the status of the chairperson's liaison group and its terms of reference. This is following the chairperson correspondence with the clerk. Are members content to note this particular correspondence?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Next matter arising is at page 15 of the pack, correspondence from the Committee for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs. This is simply a thank you letter from the committee to the Procedures Committee for the advice in respect of the potential establishment of a new Assembly Standing Committee and how that may be facilitated. And again, are members content to note that particular item of correspondence?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for that. Agenda item 4 is inquiry into the private members' bills, and we will be hearing oral evidence from a number of folk here today. Firstly, are members content for all today's oral evidence sessions to be recorded by Hansard and to be included in the committee's final report?
Agreed.
Yes, content.
Thank you for that. The committee will now receive oral evidence from Mr Colin McGrath, MLA, on his experience of the private members' bills process. And can I refer you to the clerk's paper at page 17 and a table with the collated written oral evidence received to date at page 24. And you may wish to refer to this table to be reminded of the evidence received so far, which has been collated against each of the terms of reference for the inquiry. And also, members, included in table papers today at page 3 is correspondence from the Reverend Trevor Gribben, Clerk of the General Assembly at the Presbyterian Church in Ireland. It is in relation to the committee's inquiry. And are you content for the committee staff to add this to the responses received and update the evidence table with the relevant information? Agreed?
Yes.
Thank you for that. Is Colin with us?
Yes.
Colin, you're welcome to today's meeting, and can I also thank you for taking time to come and to join with us this afternoon and to give us some insight into how you felt the process of bringing forward the private members' bill and perhaps some of the difficulties maybe that you experienced and some of the things maybe that could be changed to make life easier. So we'll hand over to you to let us know your thoughts on it.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the committee. I suppose maybe just to begin, I don't have a great deal of information to provide you with because my private members' bill was one that was conducted outside of the official support system that is provided by the Assembly. As I'm sure you are all aware, and I have learned, there are a number of private members' bills that are supported through the systems within the Assembly. And then if you're not one of the people that are selected through that mechanism, then really it is a case of you need to go it alone. And you're left to your own devices to go off and devise whatever it is that you need to do. Now, notwithstanding that, there are various staff within the Assembly who are all readily make themselves available for advice and guidance, but that very technical support in terms of drafting legislation, about getting the wording right, about potentially going off and doing a lot of the background research on the technical details, is somewhat complicated. And I think we're all, as legislators, well used to being provided with those blue documents of laws and then reading it and then waiting quickly to get the explanatory notes, because you're none the wiser having read the blue paper as to what it actually does, because it is very technical. It is replace this word with that word, change subsection 5438 to number 2.47. And that in reality doesn't mean much in plain English. So there is a requirement to go off and try and work out what that means. But likewise, if you're developing a private member's bill, you need to have it translated into that language for presentational purposes. So I was lucky in my own bill that I was able to find the support of an NGO. In my instance, it was the British Heart Foundation that provided help and support. They were experts in the area. They understood what was required, and they were able to help and advise me and provide support in the background to be able to develop the private members bill that I did. In terms of some of the more day-to-day work that needed done in terms of conducting a thorough consultation process, I had to do that within my own staff team and within my constituency office, and we worked on that. And thankfully, through utilising methods such as SurveyMonkey and others, we were able to get around about 1,000 responses, and we were able to coordinate and collate that information in-house. But it was a substantial amount of work. Once the bill was ready to be led within the Assembly and then taken on board, I suppose there was a greater deal of official support from the Assembly in terms of making sure that it was tabled, getting it through the Business Committee and onto the order paper, and then getting it from the order paper into committee. And it's currently at that committee stage at the moment. I sought an extension, or the committee rather sought an extension to investigate that process just yesterday in the House, which has been granted until February. So I haven't quite fulfilled all of the processes. And we also have some work that we're doing with the department in hoping to maybe be able to deliver what we're looking to do in a shorter period of time. So it has been a long process. It's probably been about a year and a half from we first sort of picked up. I think it was back in August 2020 that I first had conversations about the potential of doing this. And it really took until sort of round about the end of September, start of October, before we got it into the Speaker's office and then got it onto order paper. So it's quite a long, drawn-out process, which could deter some people and can prevent you from being able to get something that's relatively urgent addressed. But those, Chairman, are just really the experiences that I had through the bill. As I say, not very many experiences of the official structures within the Assembly, because I did mine just outside of it. But I'm more than happy to take any questions that anybody would have in relation to the progress of the bill and the work that we did.
Thank you very much, Colin, for your insight into the your experiences of taking the bill forward, and we'll open it up to members for questions. If any member has any questions, Joanne.
Hey Colin, thank you for your presentation, appreciate it. And it's interesting to hear you've had a slightly different experience because your bill was done externally, which in the course of this inquiry is quite interesting. The other thing that's interesting, Colin, is that there's been variances of opinion with regard to whether or not the sponsoring member should be a member of the committee ex officio. Do you have any views in that regard?
It's hard to tell. I suppose the person could be there, and there certainly is the benefit of being able to ask them for their views and ask them for their considerations. But there can also maybe be a sense that you're talking about somebody and they're in the room. I mean, if there are deficiencies potentially in the bill or disagreements about the bill, and the person is actually present in the room, it could create a bit of conflict, and it could create an element of maybe people being more hesitant to maybe critically analyse a bill because the person that's actually drafted it is in their company. There definitely, I think, is a time for talking to somebody about their bill, but I also think that there is time for having space to discuss the bill as a group of people, having taken maybe expert opinion, having taken views from people in the sector. But there would definitely, I would have a sense that if you're always talking about the bill with the person present, it could just cause that human nature of people not wanting to be critical, people not wanting to be unhappy with something, maybe people wanting to please somebody because they're there looking back at them. And really the role of the committee is to be that critical assessment. I mean, we get the opportunity in the Assembly to discuss bills, but they're generally pre-prepared thoughts. They're taken in turn. People know how they're going to speak, and quite often people know how they're going to vote before they go into a debate in the Assembly. But there is a bit more freedom within that committee structure for analysis, for questioning, for critical thinking about a bill. And if the person is constantly in the room looking back at you, it could cause a few problems. So I suppose my answer really there, Joanne, is yes and no. And maybe if there is a way of doing both where for a period of time the person is very, very available to answer questions and provide updates. But I see the merit in there being time for a committee to actually have its own time to consider what it's heard, and maybe not to do that with the pressure of the person being there.
No, I appreciate that, and I think it's a fair point, and frankly I concur with you on most that you've said there, Colin. Just if I could just ask a couple more things, if that'll be all right. With regard to your bill being external, first of all, do you consider that was a disadvantage or an advantage to you in terms of the process? And what is your interaction with the bill office now?
So in terms of advantage, disadvantage, I suppose it's a bit difficult to answer that because I haven't gone through the process through the bill office or with the support of that, so I don't have anything to compare it to. But certainly, the advantages and disadvantages that I found working with a third party was obviously the third party was keen. It wanted to see the legislation in, so it was very helpful, very supportive. I only needed to lift the phone or send an email and I got somebody there, and they were very quick to come back. If you're maybe going into something within the Assembly, you're maybe one of a dozen that they're working on, and there could be competing priorities there, so I'm not sure if that accessibility is just as quick. Definitely in terms of the content of the bill, for me it was the issue of CPR teaching in school. Obviously an organisation such as the British Heart Foundation is 100% across that matter. It knew what the issue was, it knew what the ramifications, it knew the pluses, the cons, it knew many other people in the sector, it knew exactly what was happening in the rest of the UK and Ireland in terms of where things were being delivered. So because they were experts in that particular area, they were then able to lend that expertise to me, and I suppose that maybe if you're working with somebody in-house, that expertise in a specific area may not be there. So there was pluses and minuses there, but I mean, I found using an outside agency, I didn't find it disadvantaged what I wanted to do. I found it a very reasonable, good and process that worked well. So I can't really say that it was a bad process. It was a really good process. And now that we're back in to the Assembly, we're at that committee stage. I have to commend the Bill Office and the staff and the committee staff as well, that there's just been any amount of offers of help and assistance, and did we want to meet up, did we want to discuss the progress of it. I was also, mine was a really incredibly simple bill. It was like one clause. Really, so there wasn't a lot of technical points to mine. There wasn't a lot of a lot of complicated matters to talk through and process to talk through. So I didn't need to avail of much of that help. I just needed to get it onto the floor of the Assembly and then get it into committee and get it progressed. So I have to say, I was offered substantially more help than I actually required, and just perceived that as a really good, useful and helpful thing, and thank those staff for that. But I haven't really needed to avail of it too much.
Thank you very much. Just one last one, which is one of the gaps of information that we've received back from consultees has been around the issue of whether or not there should be or could be more than one sponsor of a bill, which there'd always be a lead sponsor, but in some respects might take the pressure off the sponsoring member a bit in circumstances where they weren't able to be available at every turn. Do you have any views on that, Colin?
Well, probably no more so than yeah. I mean, more hands on deck to help is always useful. As you say, if somebody isn't available to carry out a certain element of the process, then there could be others. And I think as well, there can be quite a scramble to get lots and lots and lots of legislation through, because everybody wants to have their name to something. So if we're all trying to do that, then from a non-executive perspective, there's 75 or 80 of us running around constantly trying to get our names down for bits and pieces. Maybe if we could all, a number of people could add their names to particular bills, it could also assist sort of people feeling that they're part of a process. And also if there's, if there are even cross-party based, bills, that there maybe could be a greater chance of getting them through the process, because most of the parties are buying into them. I mean, the aim of legislation, I would hope, is to try and get it passed. It's not to try and prevent other parties or that political game plan, which is, well, if they put in a bill, we'll try and stop it. And if you know that you've got all party support, then I think there's a greater enhanced chance that a piece of legislation will get through. So being able to do that, being able to get cross-party support for a bill would be useful, and being able to add more names to it might encourage more cross-party pieces of legislation.
Thanks very much, Colin. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Colin. Any other members?
Nicola has her hand up.
Nicola?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Colin, for coming in today and for giving us that information. Joanne's actually asked my questions there. I was going to ask just if you thought it was more straightforward, not going through the official structures, and suppose maybe the fact that the NGO you used were I suppose, experts in their field in regards to like your bill and bringing through that the like CPR within school setting. That was probably a huge benefit as well, because they were like completely over their topic. Whereas I suppose in the Assembly with so many variations, such a wide range of topics, that maybe that was a benefit as well. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely was part of the process of having those experts and having a ready supply and tap to be able to get to those experts was important. Now, this absolutely hasn't happened, so I'm precursoring this by saying that this is something that I suppose there's the potential for, is that if you have an over-reliance on external help and assistance, you could be getting to the stage where those maybe with particularly vested interests in an outcome of a bill could be then trying to provide support in the background. And then you start to move into the territory, I would guess, of you've got your cash for questions, and then you've maybe got them people in the background saying, well, I'll help you with your bill because the outcome of it would help my business or help my area of interest. So I suppose there's always that fear that if you're forcing people to look out the way for too much help or assistance, it's going to fall to those that can provide the help and assistance, maybe more so than those that really would benefit from the impact of it. So we're very, very lucky, I suppose, in the north that we have such a vast array of NGOs and charitable organisations who that their outcomes are only but good. But I could see that if you leave too much to the outside, that there is always that potential that there could be a blurring of the lines of what is a vested interest and what's a particular outcome that's wanted from piece of legislation. Whereas if it's in-house and it's only your consultations that's gone out, well, those vested interests just become as an equal voice along with everybody else. Now, again, just to completely reiterated, I've no experience of that happening anywhere and haven't seen that happening, but I could see where if you're left to your own devices, that you could wander down a road and that could take you there. So I think using the in-house scheme as much as possible would definitely be preferable if it prevented that. But I don't know whether there needs to be rules that says that if you're getting a sponsored organisation that you should make sure that they are charitable or that their aims and objectives are in the greater good. But there's definitely a conversation in there somewhere about something to make sure that there's safeguards.
Absolutely, Colin. I think that's a really valid point, that the waters could get muddied very quickly there, couldn't they? So I think that's a really important point for us to take on board with this review. The only other point I want to make there was about Joanne's initial question about whether members of committee should be able to bring forward a PMB or that kind of question in a way, that kind of idea. I understand both viewpoints. One thing that I keep thinking about to go back to is, I suppose you're going to be more naturally drawn to a topic that's within your committee. So, for example, if I were to bring forward a PMB, I would most likely be something within education, because those are the issues that I see day in, daily. Do you know what I mean? So I can understand why a member of a committee would want to bring something that directly affects the committee that they sit on, but I also can understand how there could be like a conflict of interest there or whatever. So it's just another kind of point I want to make. But listen, thanks very much, Colin. It's great to hear from you. And thanks, Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Nicola. Any other members?
Ciara?
Ciara?
Yeah, thank you, Deputy Chair. Colin, I'm quite interested on the consultation process, and obviously in relation to private members' bills, we've heard evidence for and against regarding that consultation process needs to be essential, or should it be mandatory for a sponsor wishing to bring forward a private member's bill? So that's kind of one question. What's your thoughts on that? Should it be mandatory? And then secondly, I know you had external expertise to support you in the consultation, but can you unpack in relation to any maybe questions you had regarding the consultation? Who's the range of stakeholders? How far out do you go? Did you have any concerns about maybe you haven't covered all the range of stakeholders? Should department officials be engaged in that whole consultation process? So it's probably just them two kind of key areas around the consultation. Should it be mandatory? And secondly, just your thoughts on your consultees and how you were able to compile it. Thank you.
Thanks, Ciara. I would be a firm believer that you can never consult enough. And at every opportunity that you can consult. So in terms of should it be mandatory, I would think so, because as a bare minimum, you're getting out there and hearing what people's views, what their thoughts are. I think we all understand the term, the sort of Stormont bubble that we all exist in, where, we discuss something for, a number of hours in a chamber, and we talk about it in our group meetings, and then we go home and we mention it, and people look back at you and go, what was that, sorry? And you're like, we were talking all day about this. So there is that sense that we can be so engrossed in something and feel that we're so expert and knowledgeable in it, but actually when you go out into the rest of the society, that knowledge isn't there. And then likewise, our understanding and our interpretation of something may not be what other people are thinking. So even if it's only a process to get that affirmation that that you're on the right road, I think that the consultation is essential. And of course, the difficulty with consultations in terms of when do you stop or how do you know that you've got everybody is that you'll never know the people that you don't know. So, you go out to everybody and then you come back and then somebody says 6 months later, you didn't ask me, and you go, I never thought about that at the time. So it's about making sure that you've got a reasonable amount of people. I mean, what I used for mine by going with SurveyMonkey was just to try and flood social media as much as I could, and sort of I used, you would use your Facebook and trying to spread it out there and letting as many people as possible know that you're doing the consultation. Then if they bought into it, that you can do sort of through the likes of SurveyMonkey and others, you can do sort of checks that your information is coming from as broad a base as possible in terms of geographical spread. But I suppose there's always a danger, and there probably would be people much more au fait with this than myself in terms of consultation bias, that if you go and ask somebody a question, for example, about CPR, if somebody's performed CPR, that's automatically going to be of something of interest to them. And if they've already done it in the past, then they're going to be much more likely to say that they support it. So, I would certainly feel that with my consultation, to be able to say 96% of people agree with, well, then you sometimes think, well, either the question was very agreeable or maybe it wasn't unpacked enough, or it could have been thought more, because, if 100% nearly of people agree with you every question that you ask, is it a proper consultation? But I think that's maybe a different conversation that could be had with maybe some sort of academics that could sort of say, well, how do you actually get the proper questions, and then how do you get that out there? There would be people more qualified than me to answer it. But I think if a survey is quick and easy to do, then the results might be quick and easy. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's just it was a worry for me that absolutely everybody agreed with what I was saying, but maybe it meant that it was just the right policy. But consultation and doing it right is an incredibly difficult thing to do, and it is an art, and members in their own right are maybe not able to perform that. There could be a suggestion that if people are going to be doing their private members bill on their own because they weren't lucky enough to be part of the draw, maybe there's a form of consultation support that could be there, that at least if they're going to be carrying out the consultation with the public, that there's a good structured, proper way of getting help and support with that, so that it's done properly.
That's great, Colin. Thank you. I think, yes, obviously it is. It's a difficult process and time lengthy, and if you want to ensure it's as robust as possible, so you're confident in moving forward, obviously guidance to support members maybe is something that would be very worthwhile. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ciara, any other members wish to...
Chair, Rosemary here.
Yeah.
Or Vice Chair, sorry. Rosemary, Tom. Just I was interested in your consultation process in relation to, you actually put it out through social media. Do you not think that give a biased opinion? And the reason I say biased opinion, Colin, obviously your friends are all, it's through your friends and through your friends' network, and maybe I'd have different friends to you. And I was going to suggest, did you send that to every MLA so that they could pass it out through their social media, so it would at least give you a mix of people?
Thank you, Rosemary.
In all parts of the province.
Rosemary, and I have many, many friends in Fermanagh, so I'm sure that we've got plenty of shared friends down around that neck of the woods there as well. Very friendly people, so I'm sure that's 100% certain on that. But yeah, I think the point that you make as well, that the net that you cast is going to be restricted to those that are casting the net. Now, again, having had the support of the NGO, I was here, they were able to put it out through their networks of people, through the people that they had as members. They put it out through their social media streams. But I think by extension, the point that you make is well made, that, if there was... if somebody is a friend with, for example, in this case, the British Heart Foundation, there's a fairly high chance that they're going to be supportive of an initiative that delivers CPR. So, you could see that you could get that sort of skewed perspective that, of course, the people are going to say, that it's a good idea. I think the committee may have put it out as well through their official streams, or there was some form of official assembly social media account that it was put out through. But I would suspect that within the Assembly there are probably some very, very rich databases of individuals in particular sectors that are cross-sectoral, cross-society, cross-age group and whatever, that if you were able to access that and it went out through that, it would be totally separate from you as an individual, and that would be something that could be worthwhile.
Yeah, that's right. I was just also interested in what you said in relation to membership of a committee and them putting through a private members bill. For example, we listened to 2 other MLAs previously on this committee here giving evidence, and both of them found it very useful to be on the committee that they were putting forward the private members bill for.
Can I maybe just make a slight nuance difference in that? I think if a person is a member of a committee and their private members bill is reflective of that committee, I get that, because you're going to be asked what's your interest within your political party, and they're going to try and match you to the committee that best suits your interests, and you're a former teacher, so education is a perfect fit for you, Rosemary, in terms of a committee to go on to. But I suppose it was that concept I was thinking about, where they would be if you weren't a teacher and you were you weren't a member of the Education Committee and you were bringing forward a piece of a private member's bill that was in relation to education, then could you sit on that committee at all of the stages that it was going through? It's just making that concept of I think that human nature is that you would be just less critical of something if the author is sitting at the table looking back at you. I think that's human nature rather than anything that is sort of contrived or thought up before. I just think that nobody wants to say that third clause is rubbish. Whereas if the person's not there, you might be more inclined to say, look, that really is something that needs to be tightened up, it needs to be looked at differently. And likewise, if people are given evidence, if you've got an outside agency coming in to present to a committee about a bill and the bill sponsor was looking back at them, likewise, Northern Ireland's a small place, and somebody that's given evidence may not want to be 100% honest if it means being a bit critical of something if the sponsor is sitting there. And I don't think that's all the time in all the cases. I just think it's an opportunity. So there may be a way of sort of saying for most of the time, but that there should be set times that maybe a committee can just consider something without the person being there, just in case there is that issue. But yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rosemary. Well, Colin, just perhaps one issue. You have said about 18 months to get you to this stage where you're at in committee now, and we're coming to we're coming fairly close to the end of a mandate. Do you think that there should be a cut-off date when private members can bring forward a bill, or should be allowed to bring forward a bill within any mandate, in order to allow appropriate time for them to be brought through the system, be properly scrutinised and be completed prior to the end of mandate?
Yeah, I mean, Chair, I think there's definitely a value to that. We're probably in somewhat of a unique scenario because the executive-based business, and I speak maybe from my experience of being a member of the business committee, like we're for 12 months, there was nothing coming through from the executive. We're looking at the next number of months of it primarily being executive-based business because they finally got the stuff in front of us. Now, I think what we've done here is we've got a 2-year programme that's been stretched out across, that would normally be stretched out across 5 years. And definitely there's not going to be time. There's going to be a lot of private members' bills that are not going to get the opportunity to be presented and make their way through because there will be such pressures in time. So I don't know, if you're looking at maybe a normal 5-year term, if you were saying, look, if you haven't got your private members' bill done and dusted by halfway through the mandate, that it's not going to get a chance. You can't guarantee it being finished. But it would be incredibly frustrating if you've done all the work and you've all the consultations done and you've done all the long hours, and then you get to the end of the process and it runs out of time. That would be very frustrating. So anything that could be put in place to try and stop that frustration and to prevent countless hours of needless work, I think would definitely be useful.
Okay, Colin, thank you, and thank you for taking the time to be with us in committee today, and for your insight into the issues that you face whenever you're bringing forward your bill. And can I confirm with you that you're content for the committee secretary to follow up with you on further correspondence required?
Yep, absolutely, Chair, and thank you very much for the invite today to discuss this. I think it's a really important area of our work, and it's good to know that there's some of us that are looking at it to try and finesse the processes. So thank you to the committee.
Okay, thank you, Colin.
Thank you.
Right, members, agenda item 5, again we have oral evidence from John O'Dowd on his experience of the private members bill, and can I again refer you to Clerk's paper at page 17 and the other oral and written evidence at page 24. Is John with us? John?
Yes.
You're very welcome to the meeting today. I want to thank you for giving of your time and coming to speak to the committee today on your experience of bringing through a private members bill. Perhaps what you have felt to be fairly straightforward, some of the difficulties you have felt, how you think things could be maybe changed or made better or easier for a private member when they're bringing forward a bill. So we'll open up the floor to you, and then we'll ask questions later.
Okay, Chair, I'll keep my introductory remarks to a minimum because of another meeting at 3:30, so apologies for that. My experience, I suspect, are very similar to Colin's. The support and engagement with the Bills Office and other Assembly staff has been excellent. They have helped me walk through the legislative process every step of the way. In many ways, I've been fortunate. I've been in the Assembly for about 18 years. I'm also a former minister, so I am familiar with the legislative process. But when you sit down to draft your own piece of legislation, it is quite a formidable task. And it does require support both from your own team and also from the Assembly team. Moving an idea or a proposal into legislation is quite difficult, because you do then come in to direct, not conflict, but you do come against other obstacles, in the sense that it might be a good idea. Once you try to draft it into legislation, you soon realise that there are competing objectives, perhaps more worthy objectives, or other pieces of legislation that would make your piece of legislation unworkable. And there's no point in having legislation unless it is workable. So I'm currently at committee stage. I sit on the Economy Committee, where my legislation is going through. So Colin's remarks around committee member and being the sponsor of the bill, I think, are quite relevant to me, and you may want to quiz me on that. But I'm in the process now, probably the same as Colin, about 18 months. Hopefully committee stage will end, but has to end by the 28th of January, and then the committee report, then I have to make a decisions on what I do next, moving towards consideration stage. So that's my opening remarks, Deputy Chair.
Okay, thank you for your remarks today. Can I open up to committee for questions? Any member, any questions for John?
Yes, Chairman, I'll ask John a couple of questions.
Joanne?
John, thanks. So your experience, I suppose, is slightly different because you are sitting on the Economy Committee, and some members who have had that experience have found it really worthwhile. Others feel there's potential for conflict. I suppose the question that's in front of us is whether or not, if members are not a sitting member of the committee, whether or not they should be a member of the committee ex officio. Do you have views on that?
Well, I think there is a balance to be got. The fact that I do sit on the committee is useful, because I'm involved with all the committee discussions. I'm hearing the witness statements firsthand, and the ability to ask questions and even engage with my fellow committee members around the legislation. But I also note Colin's remark, and I think it's worth considering. Does that also work against the scrutiny of the bill? Do people who are witnesses feel that they are inhibited in making commentary because the bill sponsors sitting there looking at them? None of my committee colleagues are shrinking violets, I can assure you, but does it inhibit them in terms of the scrutiny of the bill if I'm there as a committee member and I've formed relationships with them in co-working, etc. So I think that is worth further consideration, but there are certainly benefits from being on the committee as your bill goes through that committee.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Joanne. Any other member wishes to?
Nicola and then Ciara.
Nicola, okay, go ahead, Nicola.
Thank you, Deputy Chair, and thanks, John, for that there. Just on your last point, I kind of made this before as well. I think that just even having that expertise within the committee could be a help to other committee members whenever you're going through the legislation and just be able to bounce off questions easily. I know that we've went through, in the Education Committee, went through the Integrated Education Bill at great detail, and it would have been really handy to have the bill sponsor there on many occasions to clarify points for us, you know. But I totally understand that their point where there could be the kind of conflict of interest as well. Can I ask you about how you found the consultation process? Did you find it lengthy, helpful? How did you find it?
Again, large organisations and even government departments find it difficult in terms of the challenge of how you ensure that your consultation is inclusive and reaching as many people as possible. I like Colin, again, I conducted my survey on SurveyMonkey. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me who responded, but it was in the low hundreds, if that. And I sponsored mine through social media and local papers. As far as I'm aware, I shared it with other MLAs, and I also think the committee sent it out as well. But no one, in my opinion, has yet got the perfect recipe yet for how you conduct a consultation. And it's very, very difficult for a singular MLA with 2.5 full-time staff to be able to perfect the consultation. Now, I think in terms of consultations, there's always an opportunity for those organisations who are equipped and who have staff to respond to you. And there's some well-resourced organisations in the sector my legislation's involved around energy, who can respond. But the general members of the public, our community groups, our interested bodies, I think that smaller bodies have a difficulty in having those resources to respond. So I don't know the answer to it, but I don't think what we're doing currently is perfect. And that's one area where perhaps if there was additional resources or support from the Assembly, I think would be quite useful.
Yeah, I'd say you're right there, John, and I don't think this would alleviate those problems, but you may have heard in the last discussion with Colin that there was this discussion about having more than one MLA's name attached to a PMB, so maybe we could go some way to at least promoting the fact that the consultation was out, whatever, but I'll not alleviate all the problems. Listen, thanks very much for that. That's all from me. Thank you. Thanks, Deputy Chair.
Okay, thank you. Ciara?
Was that me, Deputy Chair? Yeah.
Yep, go ahead, yep.
The volume's a bit down. Can you hear me okay? I think the volume's just a wee bit down.
Yeah.
John, thank you for coming along. And with regards to consultation, I agree. I think it's probably an area, particularly with just local constituents, local households and C&V sector, how they can effectively engage, and how we can improve upon that. But a couple of other wee questions I wanted to ask you. What would be your views in relation to potential deadlines for submission of private member bills to the Speaker's office? Whether that's drafted through the Bills office or if it's ready drafted. Do you think we should have deadlines for submission? So kind of more a systematic approach for members so they're aware when the deadlines are set to set one in. Maybe it might ease the burden of Assembly business and reduce the risk of the likes of a private member's bill not completing its passage through the Assembly.
Ciara, to be honest with you, I don't have a firm position on it. And I suspect in reality there are deadlines existing because in practical terms, by the time you do your initial proposal, you work with the drafters, etc., you're talking months on most occasions before you can get a bill on the floor of the Assembly. Now, in some instances, and I've seen this, where outside bodies or individuals will draft legislation for a member or the proposal, and that'll move it on quicker. So it means that a bill could reach the floor quicker. So there's pros and cons to it, but the reality of the next few months is that, as Colin has said, I suspect a number of private members' bills will fall. I suspect a number of executive bills will fall because executive ministers will now be prioritising what their legislation will be to go through. And that's just the reality of the time frame within which we're working towards an election. So I would certainly have to give it more careful consideration before I could give a definitive answer as to whether there should be a deadline or not.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you again. Joanne?
John, look, thanks, Chairman, for letting me come back in. John, a couple of things. You also sit in the Business Committee, and you're a Chief Whip. Do you have any views as to whether or not there should be dedicated plenary days to private members' business?
I think there's merit to it. I suspect 2 days of legislative debate in the Assembly chamber isn't giving justice to the amount of work. Believe it or not, I know some members of the public may, they're not doing that much, but there's significant amounts of legislation and policy going through the Assembly, and it deserves proper scrutiny. And you know my views in terms of, I don't necessarily believe quantity of debate is the same as quality of debate. So I think if there was a dedicated legislative day, an additional day, rather than cutting down from 2 to 1, but 2 to 3, then I think that would allow for better scrutiny and more legislation going through. But I'll caveat with this point: not every proposal requires legislation or primary legislation. So I think even in terms of private members' bills, that there may have to be some form of control in regards, and obviously this is a final decision of MLAs, they vote on these matters, whether a proposal which is merited, worthwhile, doesn't require primary legislation to enact it. Because primary legislation is a very important document. It's very difficult to introduce and also very difficult to revoke. So once you go down the primary legislation route, it's in place for a considerable amount of time. So I think an additional day would be certainly worth trialling.
Thank you, and I appreciate your push for time. So just, I suppose, one last issue I wouldn't mind if you would cover, and that's with regard to resources. You're also aware that a number of the bills may not come to fruition at the end, and yet resources will have been spent on them, in the knowledge that they won't get through the full process. Likewise, there have been some responses to this consultation, to our inquiry, that have indicated that private members' bills should have the same resources afforded to them as departments have. Do you have any views on that?
I don't think it's possible in terms of the resources available to the entire Assembly operation, including the executive, etc., to donate the same amount of resources to private members' bills as there is to executive departments. And I suspect if you were sitting talking to some executive departments, they would be saying they need more resources as well to deal with the amount of policy and legislation they have to deal with as well, because there's not an infinite resource there either. So I think we have to be mindful of the use of public funds and the best use of public funds. A number of bills are going to fall in this mandate, though a lot of the groundwork has been done on them and scrutiny has been done on them to allow them to be lifted at an advanced stage in the next mandate, and if they need to be progressing. No, I think there's a responsibility on every member. Now, I have to come to this conclusion myself after my committee stage has been moved as to whether I move it through consideration stage. And I have to look at the evidence that's been presented to the committee, and the views that have been presented to the committee, obviously the committee report, and as to whether I have to answer the question I asked earlier: is legislation required to achieve the policy objective I set out to achieve? And if that answer is no, then I think the time has been well spent in terms of what the committee, the legislative framework and all that's been set out. If the answer is yes, I will move it forward. But I think all members have to ask themselves that question.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Rosemary, did you want in?
John, thank you very much for your thoughts and views. I was interested in what you thought was perhaps maybe a third plenary day in Stormont. Do you not think that might have a little bit of a disadvantage to smaller parties? In the sense that there's less numbers to take on the work for Monday and Tuesday, and they're keeping going on the so we say the Wednesday, and then committees on another day. It's 4 days.
Well, Rosie, I'll emphasise it's only me thinking out loud. I'm not proposing it as a firm proposal. And the issues you have raised would have to be carefully considered before you would move to a firm proposal on that. The only reason I thought out loud on it is because I think there is an opportunity for more legislation to be passed, particularly as you come to the end of a mandate. Nobody wants to rush legislation. You have to scrutinise it properly. It may be an occasional extra sitting. It doesn't have to be every week. But you make a fair comment. There is significant pressures on all the political parties. There's pressures on the smaller parties, and there's also pressures on the individual MLA who's bringing forward a private member's bill, because it is an additional workload, and quite a significant additional workload on you. And while others may not believe us, we all know that MLAs are busy. So I would take that all into the round before I would definitively come down on one side or the other, Rosemary.
Okay, thank you, John.
Okay, thank you, John, for coming to committee today, and I know you're caught for time at the minute, so I want to thank you for giving us an insight into your thoughts on the issue of private members' bills. And if we need to correspond with you later on through the clerk of the committee, you're happy for that? Okay.
Yes, Deputy Chair, I'm happy with that.
Thank you, John.
Okay, thank you, and thank you to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Members' Committee will now receive oral evidence from the Assembly Bill Office on the private members' business process. And of course, we're going to receive a briefing by Starleaf from Frank Geddes, Clerk Assistant, and from James Gillison, the Bill Clerk. And Frank, are they with us?
Yes.
I'm here, Deputy Chair.
Okay, and we thank you for coming with us today. And members, there is a written paper that came to us about a couple of hours ago from the Bill Office, and I know you wouldn't have had time to digest all of this as yet. So what we will do is we'll hear the oral evidence and we can ask whatever questions we have, and then if we need to have Frank and James back with us again at some stage, we can always do that if there are other issues that arise out of the written evidence that we have before us today. So Frank and James, you're very welcome to today's meeting, and thank you for taking the time to be with us this afternoon, and can we invite you to address the committee?
Thank you very much, Deputy Chair. It's a pleasure to be here. As you mentioned there, the paper has been circulated to the committee, and again, you've mentioned I'm happy to come back on any of the issues raised on that. I think what I intend to do in terms of this session is set out what's in that paper in broad terms and some of the themes that are in it. And there's two aspects to that paper. The first is responding to some of the discussions that the committee has already had in terms of evidence from members. I know that's bringing us right up to date. I've been listening with interest to the two previous members, Colin and John, offering their perspective, some interesting points made. And then also the second part of that is looking at your terms of reference and identifying potential options that the committee might want to take into consideration in terms of reforming the process or new approaches that might be taken procedurally. So that's the structure of the paper. I think the first thing I would want to set out, there were some of the broad themes. I did provide the committee with an earlier paper, and it mentioned 4 specific areas that the committee would want to take into consideration. And the first one of those was the level of service. What level of service do you want in terms of PMB development, in terms of the support for the member throughout the process? The second principle on that is access. So how accessible should the service be? How should you, in terms of the rules around members accessing it and all of that. The third principle was about fairness between members. How do you manage the system in order to ensure that it's fair amongst all MLAs? And then the fourth one is, how do you plan and manage the legislative programme across the mandate? And how do PMBs fit into that structure? So just in terms of that, before we go into reflections on evidence so far, there's a few points I would make. The first is, there is a certain trade-off at play here between, if you like, breadth and depth of support. Obviously, the greater numbers and volume you have of bills within the system, the more the support is more thinly spread across that higher volume. So that begs the question of, what rules do you have in place to manage the level of demand that you have? And ultimately then, that's not the only consideration. The other consideration is the particular circumstances of the Assembly. For example, the fact that it's a power sharing model, and that our model actually prioritises members being able to legislate and places a high value on that. So it's balancing those two things out. And the other thing to say is, just when you look around different systems, there are different ways in which this can be managed. It can be managed by procedural rules in terms of, it's usually a mix, in fact, of procedural rules. How do you access it? What are the rules after a bill's introduced and before it's introduced? And then also resources and capacity. So there's a certain amount of rationing that comes by necessity because of the finite capacity you have in the system to support the volume of bills that are there. So those are the sorts of issues that I'm going to touch upon, Deputy Chair, and I'm just going to move then to the first element of that paper, which is reflecting on some of the themes from the evidence to date. I think the first thing to say on this is, and it's been mentioned I think already, is that we're in a very unique mandate. We have a 2-year compressed time frame. With the resource that the Commission had invested in private members' bills at the beginning of this shortened mandate, we've been able to draft and introduced 11 supported private members' bills. That's equal to the total amount that was drafted and introduced in the full 5-year mandate of 2011 to 2016. So that gives you a sense of where that resource has paid off in terms of supporting members. The challenges we have, of course, are the timeframes, and that's been touched on as well. Traditionally, we say there's a minimum of 18 months between your initial proposal, so your policy idea, your outline, and actually getting a bill introduced to the floor of the Assembly. So there's a lot of complexity in that process. But one thing to note is, the development process is new to this mandate, and if members are minded that at least that should be maintained before you look, beyond and how you configure that, then they want to give consideration to whether at least retaining the resource that was provided then is taken forward into the next mandate, and then look again at how you build upon that and configure that. One of the themes that then emerged within that was timescales and timeframes, the length of time it takes to get from one end of the process to another in development. There's a few things in there, and I think they've been touched on again already. There's the issue of the different steps that are required of the member in terms of consultation, engagement with the department, final proposal to the Speaker, etc., and then the drafting of a bill and the redrafting of a bill, and then also you get to the drafting of the bill documents, including the explanatory and financial memorandum. I think it's worth just highlighting the benefits of those steps and why those steps are in place. I think they've been touched upon. One of the key elements of that is ensuring the member has an opportunity to get behind the depths of the policy issues that their bill provokes, takes research from RAISE and is supported by that in terms of the policy background, legal advice in terms of the competence of the bill, again, making sure that the bill can be drafted within competence, again, beginning to engage with the implications of the bill more broadly, any financial implications that it may provoke, and those things are designed primarily as well to equip the member at the point where they then get a bill introduced, that a lot of that thinking has been developed through that process. So there's a method to that, if you like, in terms of those steps and how they are managed. Another thing that was mentioned, of course, was the drafting process. What model do we have? We have a panel of drafters, external drafters. And so the benefit of that system is it's very flexible. We can instruct when we need and when we get to the point of demand. And equally, that's a different situation where you have an in-house service where you might have fluctuations in demand throughout a mandate, whereas if you've a steady cost there at all times, that's quite different. Whereas we can manage this in line with the demand and maintain the cost and do it in a cost-effective way. So that's just a little bit about that. I mean, resourcing generally. The other thing about the current mandate is obviously we're balancing out a number of things here. I mean, the way the process is managed is members are rewarded for making progress at each stage. So the quicker you make progress through the stages, the better chance you're going to have when you get to the far end of the process. And that's managed through a queuing system. And the reason for that is simply because if you were to make any value judgments about which bills should proceed or over others in another way, I mean, that would be very challenging in terms of the Speaker and for members, because obviously you want to maintain impartiality and preserve fairness, which is one of the principles I was mentioning earlier. Another thing that was mentioned, I noted, was pre and post introduction support. So, there's a lot of support and intensive support at the developmental stage. And then whenever the bill is introduced, the member steps across, if you like, into the scrutiny process. And in that process, there's obviously supported in terms of amendments by the bill clerk and advice on that. But so is the committee, and so are other members in the process. So it's quite a different experience. There are, and I'll mention later on, there are other systems which have support at a later stage after introduction, but the trade-off that needs to be taken into account there is those other systems then have controls on the volume that you have. So in terms of the resource you spend, there's a trade-off there to consider, and I've outlined some of that for the committee in the paper. And you really clarifying those rules in terms of your legal services, the bill clerk, how the drafters work. The drafting process itself has been effective and has turned around at good pace, generally speaking. And I think the issue is not so much the drafting process as it is all the steps that get you to that process and getting through those. But again, they're put in place with the aim of developing good legislation and having those processes and giving the member a platform in which to promote their bill. And the last thing, just on the first part of that then, just to say there were issues about communications and how things operate. I think one of the things that we have noticed is we've gotten now the experience of this mandate in terms of how things have gone at different stages of it, how members have found that. And one of the things the team has done is conduct really a business process review, which is ongoing, to sort of say, right, what is the communication to the member at the beginning, throughout the process? How do we support them and make them aware of the challenges that you face at each step? And some of the things I've said in the paper is I think we'd be looking to, the development of a manual to support the existing guidance from the Speaker and how we can improve communications as well and develop that going forward. And we have the experience of this mandate now. One of the challenges with timescales is that trade-off between volume and the fact that when members that are more advanced get into an advanced stage where they're drafting and redrafting bills, quite a bit of resources assigned there. And again, that's managed against also trying to help other bills proceed. So there is a balance to be struck there. A couple of things just to mention. The consultation is published on the Assembly website. I know there was some discussion about that. But again, I think there's an area there where we could look at how the consultation process is rolled out and supported as well. So there's a number of different ways that we can improve, I think, the process generally and learn from this mandate. And the second part, Chair, I've mentioned was consideration of your terms of reference and developing options. So I'm just going to outline in broad terms some of the things that the paper talks about in that regard. I think the first one in your terms of reference is asking, about use of resources and is it the right use of resources? I've mentioned there that there's a balance then to be struck between, access to the system versus, the management of that across the mandate, and we'll talk about that. There was approaches then in other jurisdictions. So, for example, the closest comparator to our model would be in the Scottish Parliament, and they would have an entry threshold of support for members. So you have to achieve the support of 18 MSPs and half the parties in the Bureau. Now, you can set that at various different points. The advantage of that is obviously you can signify some support at an early stage before you go out to drafting and expend money on drafting in that regard. The other side of that is, it also then sets that bar at that stage. What I've said in terms of the Assembly is I don't think in the paper that you could have a pre-legislative debate on a PMB, which requires a simple majority of the House, but I don't think that's where we are in terms of the Assembly as an institution, where we want smaller parties and a broader contribution to the legislative process. I think you can strike that at different levels to get that balance right between access versus ensuring that it's a relatively open system and remains an open system. And the other thing about that is, as I say, there's a link between that then, because in the Scottish model they have support after introduction, and again that's linked to how many bills you have within the system. I talked a little bit in the paper about the Welsh model, and I felt, it's more restrictive in terms of its balloting process, and it's quite different from where we are and be much more restrictive system than we have. But I've unpacked that anyway and compared that. The issue then came about external bills and bills that are developed outside the system as against those bills that are developed within the system. And a couple of points on that. I mean, the first point is, you would say, well, if you're putting in place principles of developing legislation, there might be a perceived unfairness if members that have certain access to resources can then come, develop potentially bills, through the middle of that, if you like, or there's, incentives to go around that process. But the other side of that coin is, members then have another avenue of legislation which they can take forward. I mean, there's different approaches outlined in that. You could require, for example, consultation, which has been mentioned already. You could place procedural requirements on all bills. Again, that's something where you have in the Scottish Parliament. And equally, you could, or you could require all bills to come through one channel, and I've unpacked some of the advantages and disadvantages of those approaches within the paper. Moving on then to the issue of ex officio membership of a committee, I thought there was a really interesting discussion there amongst members, and one of the things about that, and I think it was touched on, there's a slight difference here than when a member is an existing member of a committee, and I think Nicola and others had mentioned about, it would be natural for you to bring forward a bill that was within that policy area of interest. That's different, I think, to ex officio membership, because we have to give regard to the balance of voices at the committee. An ex officio membership then would be injecting an additional member, and there's very specific requirements then within the Northern Ireland Act and standing orders about the balance with D'Hondt and at a committee. So there's things to be taken into consideration there in that regard. I know there's been issues touched upon already about the management of that, and is it beneficial in terms of witnesses? There are benefits to the member, certainly, and potentially to the committee, but there are other issues to weigh in the balance there, I think, which is useful to talk about. Scheduled plenary days was also mentioned, Deputy Chair, and the paper talks about that, and it unpacks that a bit and says, well, you would have to get a balance there, because you could potentially, again, have quite a rigid approach whenever demand is likely to fluctuate. So flexibility in scheduling can be advantageous in that regard. It's important to weigh that in the balance. And co-sponsorship was mentioned in terms of would that be an option? That's talked about as well within the paper. And one of the things that I've mentioned there relates to, there would be advantages there for the member in terms of, you could say, well, you split the load, you've got greater support. The issue counter, however, with that is some of the benefits that I mentioned earlier about getting under the skin of the bill, the depth of knowledge of a single point of contact and a single sponsor is quite important in terms of when you get to the post-introduction stage. And again, you've got a single point of development there, both for the team supporting you in developing it and for the member. On the other hand, there are other options in there about you could have registered supporters of a bill. And for example, I noted the members talking about, could that be an assistance in terms of spreading consultation and awareness of consultation? So that might be, something which is in the middle of that particular option. And then the last thing you'll be pleased to hear, Deputy Chair and members, I'm going to mention is the issue of management across the mandate and the potential for deadlines. So in the Scottish Parliament, they have a deadline of the beginning of the first sitting day in June, which is immediately preceding the next parliamentary election. The advantage of that again is, now there's flexibility, I should say, there's an exceptionality provision, but again it's quite narrow in terms of to extend that into September. But there is a hard and fast deadline there, Deputy Chair, which in our system it's managed by the Speaker. So we have to, this would be a question of should we put that on standing orders? And the benefit of that obviously is it gives you greater certainty in terms of the volume at the end of the mandate when traditionally we have a lot of executive business going through. And we have to then balance that out with the rest of the considerations in terms of supporting members, at what point we spend public money and resources supporting bills. So there's quite a lot in that, Deputy Chair, but I think I would just close by saying, and just coming back to the issue of, there's a few things I think is just worthy of consideration in terms of thinking about our system. One is we have a relatively open system in relation to PMBs comparatively. I think that is something which reflects the ethos of the Assembly, and also I think any changes we would want to look at our particular circumstances and do they fit within our rules. There are other examples in the Irish system and in the Welsh system and so on which we could look at, but we would have to think about how they would fit within our framework. And I suppose that the last thing just strategically then to say is that point about going back to those core principles. What sort of a service do we want? The breadth versus depth issue. How do we get a system which is fair, reflects the Assembly's ethos and helps us to plan across a 5-year mandate? So I think that's more than enough for me, Deputy Chair. I'm happy to take any questions along with James that members may have.
Thank you very much for that, Frank. And James, do you want to add anything before we open up for questions?
No, Deputy Chair, not really. Just to make two very quick observations in addition to Frank's material there, that he mentioned that 11 bills had been introduced, and I'd just like to say that the other 12 of the 23 bills that were submitted before the Speaker's deadline have been or are being drafted. So work is ongoing with those in the background. So we're not resourcing only the 11 that have been introduced, if you like, via the Bill Office. There is still work to go. The Speaker had mentioned in his last letter to members on the 27th of October the idea of a sort of bridged into the next mandate, which John O'Dowd spoke about, that if the work is done, it can at least be carried forward into the next mandate if time does indeed beat some of the PMBs.
Just Deputy Chair, very quickly, to reiterate what James has said there, that would then bring you to a situation where you would be drafting almost double the largest amount that was drafted in a previous mandate. So that gives you a sense of the, if you like, money in the bank that will come, from the development service and the work that's been done in this mandate to date.
Thank you.
And if I may, Deputy Chair.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, just one last point was to say that there was some talk about stakeholders and third-party groups working with members on ready drafted bills. I think it's fair to point out too that with plenty of the supported bills, there has been very proactive engagement between the members and charities and so on in the development of their policy and so on, and also to assist the members when working through drafts and that sort of thing. But it's very important that we at each stage ensure that it's only the member that signs off any decisions or works that's made. But that interaction does happen and happens very proactively.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. And perhaps just in opening up for questions, can I ask, there is the concern, I suppose, with regard to continuity of staff, the turnover of staff within the Bill Office. Are there any measures in place to maintain that continuity? For example, from a plan is in place for the same staff to provide support from pre-drafting right through to committee scrutiny stage?
Yeah, Deputy Chair, I think there's a couple of things to say on that. First is that you have a slightly different system in place, and it comes back to the point about resources, I think, as well, because ultimately that would require you, if you in effect, to fully separate the system. So the model we have in place in the bill office here is that you have a development unit, and the plan then was that at a certain point in the mandate, as we get towards the end, the resource would then recombine to clerk the existing bills within the system. So the issue in terms of intensity of resource pre and post introduction, again, that's connected quite closely to the volume of bills. In terms of, so there's a reason, if you like, why bill clerk is different on the other side of the system, after a bill is introduced, because they're advising, the committee, the member, and the other members. Now, in practice, we've shared that resource, and it's not a hard and fast separation, but in general terms, they're quite distinct rules. But certainly in terms of general continuity of staff, we've been very focused on growing the experience of staff within the bill office and the planning of that in terms of the resources that we've put in order to get us to a position in the next mandate where we can draw upon that, and corporate memory and staff experience, if that's helpful, Deputy Chair.
Thank you for that, and we'll open up to our members. Members indicating, any member?
Ciara?
Ciara, sorry, Ciara, go ahead.
Thank you, Deputy Chair, and thank you, Frank and James. Pretty comprehensive kind of overview, and obviously of the scale of the work that you're doing. So congratulations to you to be able to get through what you are doing. A couple of wee things, and obviously just from our previous speakers, I'm just trying to unpick regarding the pre-consultation stage for private member bills. Just kind of what's your thoughts on that? Because we have some saying, should it be mandatory, as a requirement, given that, if it gets through the committee, there will be a consultation. So your thoughts on that. And then secondly, if you do believe, and obviously in principle, that it should be mandatory, does the bill office provide any general training on, obviously, the overall process, but likewise, particularly the pre-consultation process for members on private member bills? Is it feasible or...
Well, thanks very much for that, Ciara. It's a very good question. I think there is support in terms of from the current development unit to the member in terms of the consultation process, but the member holds the responsibility for that. Again, if you're looking at striking a balance in the system, you might think to yourself, well, we could actually be more involved there with the member. That could be one area where you could increase support. But again, I suppose it's about looking at the balance across the piece and saying, at what stages do we inject greater support and how do we manage that resource as a whole? So, both in terms of the consultation, there's a lot of intensive work then with drafting, but certainly, the development of the consultation element of that process is very important. In terms of whether or not it's mandatory, I mean, ultimately, the Assembly is, I think, through our process is clearly signalling that all of these steps in terms of consulting, engaging with the department are quite fundamental steps in terms of developing good legislation. So it certainly would have the benefit of ensuring that a bill, when members come to debate the bill, as I say, they've got a broader perspective coming from that consultation. I think I was mentioning, all of that development work, if you like, is money in the bank for the member to actually build their capacity then to take that bill forward and promote it in the House. So. Yeah, I mean, I think there are benefits to that approach. I've outlined that. Again, there's a variety of approaches in terms of, do you require only certain steps, or do you require of all bills, or do you require, a much broader range of steps? So that's all up for consideration.
Okay, that's great. And just and secondly, just with regards to deadlines for submission of private member bills, and I know and agree, and it is good that we have an open process at this moment in time, and and that's the ethos, and you'd like to retain that. But just kind of what's your thoughts on it? Just obviously, to ease the burden maybe of Assembly business and yourselves to try and manage the resources that we have. What's your thoughts regarding having deadlines? And I know you've mentioned Wales and elsewhere, but just your own personal thoughts, just to manage the burden of the Assembly process, would it help?
Well, I think ultimately, yes, particularly at the end of the mandate, where if you have a clear rule, I mean, it could help members from the point of view of giving them some certainty. There's a clear date, perhaps in standing orders, which said this is the deadline, and then it will help the team work with the member towards that as well and plan that. So, under the system, the Speaker has managed it. It's not to say there's no deadlines at the moment. That this mandate has been very unique in that the Speaker has relaxed deadlines in order to allow members to progress with PMBs and actually to get a return on the investment that the Assembly's made in PMBs. But looking ahead in terms of the full 5-year mandate, there's definitely advantages to an approach which says this is the date then, because then you basically unlock resource effectively that might be spent in supporting bills that have less chance of passage in order to help those bills that do. But in this mandate, there are particular reasons why that approach wasn't taken.
Yeah. No, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
Joanne,
Joanne?
then
Yeah.
Nicola.
Thanks very much, Chairman. Gents, thanks very much for your briefing. You'll appreciate that at the time at which the paper came in, you've given a very comprehensive oral briefing, but most of us haven't had the opportunity to consider your written paper, so we may well have to come back to you with regard to the issues contained in that whenever we get a chance to read it. But with regard to your oral briefings, I suppose I've got a couple of things. In terms of the process that goes on with private members' bills and selections, members previously giving evidence have mentioned a draw. Certainly I'm not familiar with what that is and what the process is at the start. Maybe you could give us some indication as to what exactly that is.
Well, there isn't a draw, Joanne. There is how it worked in terms of the resumption of business in the mandate was the Speaker set a deadline for initial proposals. So it was open to all members to submit a proposal by a certain date. Again, that date was extended. But if you met that date, then you were in the process. And then you can move forward, and then you had to achieve certain milestones that took you to final proposal, which is where the Speaker signs off for you to get access to the drafting service. So, I mean, there's not a ballot system or a system of chance that happens in other legislatures like Westminster or Wales. So it's supposed just to clarify that, Joanne.
Okay, just one more issue. Obviously, previous members just before you came in and had made mention of an additional sitting. You may be aware there's been some discussion about this, at the Business Committee, because under the current pressures that exist, it's fine to introduce additional legislation into the mix, but ultimately that's one phase of the process that comes at the expense of another, because if you introduce an additional sitting, additional plenary day for legislation, then that eats into committee time, and those committees are considering the legislation. Therefore, they perpetually extend and on and on and on. Do you have views? I appreciate it's a political decision to some extent, but do you have views on the implications for the Bill Office in circumstances where there were to be an additional plenary day for legislation whilst committees are still scrutinising legislation?
I've talked a bit about that in the paper, John. As I say, I mentioned I'm obviously happy to come back on those points at a later stage. I think the issue there, of course, is how do you avoid a system which is quite rigid and might create some of the challenges that you highlight, for knock-on effects in terms of committees and so on, versus the model we have at the minute, which is quite flexible. But I mean, there are other ways you might look at your procedural rules generally in relation to PMBs. It might not necessarily be dedicated sittings. There might be other approaches that could be used, and indeed even within standing orders at the moment, there's provisions to prioritise bills that are further within the process that the Business Committee can avail of in terms of their decision making. So, there are pros and cons in terms of that. The issue is you wouldn't want to institute something that was quite rigid and would have those negative effects. But equally, you'd want to balance that out and look at how the system operates as a whole.
Thank you.
And it's flexible.
Is there you'd mentioned that for internal bills, the Assembly has a panel of external drafters.
Yeah.
And those bills are shipped out to be drafted. How is that different, or better or worse, from a member who has a third-party drafter?
Well, ultimately through the supported process, John, they've gone through a procurement process. So there's a quality assurance and a rigorous process that the drafters have been through within that in order to demonstrate, if you like, their skills and level of experience in drafting. So that's part of the, if you like, quality added by the assembly process, is that if you go through that process, you're assured of accessing a drafter with that level of skills and experience. And then that again added with the other steps in the process means you're less likely to encounter challenges later on in the process. Now, there's always going to be, as we know, and it's a matter of politics in terms of disagreements over the policy of a bill and so on. But the idea of having the panel is to say that members have access to quality drafting services with appropriate skills and experience to deal with the complexities of legislation. And that's something that we can sort of vouchsafe through that process.
Okay, and finally, unless you say something in the next answer that's going to make me want to delve deeper, just with regard to the resources issue, we're all fully aware that there are bills that are currently being progressed that will not make it through until the end, and they'll fall. And at this point, staff in the bill office will have invested considerable time and energy and expertise into those bills, and yet they're not going to make it. And that is at the expense of others. So, as somebody who manages that department, what views do you have with regard to the maximisation of resources in the bill office?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things within the paper, which hopefully will come out when you get a chance to read it, Joanne, is that balance between the volume that you have to deal with and contend with, and the bill office manages, and the level of resource and support that can be provided. So those things are closely connected. Some of the issues that have been mentioned about deadlines for introduction in the latter part of the mandate. And potentially other procedural mechanisms which can occur can help you manage that. But against that, obviously, the committee will want to consider how do we strike that balance right for us in terms of having a system where we're encouraging members and supporting members to develop legislation, but avoiding those volume and capacity challenges as best as we can, as you outline.
Okay, thanks very much, Frank.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Nicola?
Thank you, Deputy Chair, and thank you, Frank and James, for all that information, really comprehensive breakdown of it. Thanks for that. I was actually going to ask, as an extension of Ciara's point, about your opinion on extending the plenary days, but I'll not go into that since you've given detail to Joanne's question there. So I'll ask you this instead, and it may be outside your remit, but maybe you can give me your opinion anyway. I think it was when Chris Little was in this committee giving evidence about his PMB, he'd raised the issue about individual MLAs having access to legal advice, assembly legal advice. I think committees have the opportunity to receive that advice, so that we, like as a committee, can get full understanding of the implications of PMB, but individual MLAs aren't. And that was one point he'd made, that essentially we should have access to that. It would be better if we could have access to that. So I'm just wondering what your viewpoints are on that, Frank and James, if you're there.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Nicola. I suppose the first thing to say about that is there's access to legal advice at the pre-development or pre-introductory stage, which then ensures the bill is competent. So that's the first thing. So I suppose to distinguish the pre-introduction stage and from what you're talking about, which is the scrutiny stage of the bill, and at what stage you would access at that point. I think ultimately the bill clerk is there to draft amendments on behalf of the member, including the sponsor, advise them on that. The sponsor then feeds into the committee in terms of issues the committee might raise if they take legal advice. The other thing, of course, to bear in mind is, when a bill comes through its consideration stage, if there are issues raised by amendments, then quite often the Executive Department and the Office of Legislative Counsel have incentive then to step in and deal with any legal issues that will arise, because ultimately they will have responsibility for operating the bill and the bill's provisions. And so there are safeguards, and equally the bill is again checked for competence before final stage. So there are safeguards within the process to avoid those sort of issues arising. The other challenge, I suppose, with access to legal advice is the sheer speed in terms of and resource there, the sheer speed in terms of turnaround for amendments. Nicola, I know don't need to tell members about turnarounds that can happen quickly between stages, and then also it's a question of who's the best person to give advice at the best stage, and looking at that holistically, and I've mentioned that in the paper, so hopefully that's helpful as well. Sort of let members think, okay, should we invest resources in this stage and for this purpose, or for this stage and for this purpose? Hopefully that's helpful. Nicola, I don't know if...
It is, Frank. Thank you for that. And I haven't got reading the paper, so I'll get a read of that there as well. But I think it's an important kind of topic for us to be looking at whenever we're going through this review. So thank you for that, and thanks, Deputy Chair.
Okay, and I know the Speaker is here at this moment in time to come and to give us his presentation. So perhaps Frank and James, can I thank you for your presentation, your in-depth oral presentation today, and no doubt whenever we get time to go through the written response, we will come back to you with any of the issues that we have. So thanks again for your attendance at committee today.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. Thank you, members.
Members Committee will now receive oral evidence from the Speaker, Mr Alex Maskey, on his views of the private members' process at the Assembly. And can I refer you to the Clerk's paper at page 50, and also included in the table papers at page 7 is a written submission from the Speaker with views on the private members' bills process. And, Mr Maskey, we welcome you to our meeting today. Thank you for taking the time to come this afternoon, and no doubt this is perhaps a unique experience in one way, in that the Speaker, I don't think, has ever given evidence to a committee before, if I'm right, and obviously with the importance that the private members' bill plays now within the legislative system here within the Assembly, then we do thank you for giving us your time and for coming to us today, and we will open the floor to you, and then we will open up for some questions following that.
Thank you, Chairman, for that welcome, and on the basis that it maybe will be the first speaker to attend here, I hope you'll go easy on me then. You'll be getting your own back for anything in the past couple of years. No, I want to first of all thank the committee for first of all undertaking the review, more importantly, and then giving me the opportunity to say a few words. Obviously, I know the committee is very, very busy and you're taking a lot of evidence in this, and that's very good, and so therefore I don't want to take up any more time than necessary, and I have provided a paper to the committee for your own perusal and reading, and some of that has been covered very well by some of our officials, Frank and James and so on. So I just want to, if you don't mind, I would just kind of skirt over a number of key issues that I think just need to be considered, and I've heard what some of the committee report so far this afternoon, and some of them have already been touched on, and I think they're important to be maybe reiterating some of the points, given that from the Speaker's role and from our office, the Bills office and the Business Committee office and my role and all of that, you can maybe sometimes see a wider perspective than maybe one other or individuals may be able to do. First of all, I think I would like to say that it's better to look at, I do think it's better to look at this here, set the PMBs within a framework, possibly underpinned and probably underpinned by standing orders, rather than leading us from one speaker to another speaker. That's how traditionally this has been dealt with. It just carries on speaker to speaker to kind of continue to develop these rules and regulations around this. So I think it would be useful to look at it within the context of a framework itself. And obviously what will underpin the framework will be a key kind of principles as to how you do that. First one for me would be, obviously, you need to have well-developed legislation. And that means it needs proper consideration and proper scrutiny, and all that actually entails. I think you need to kind of be fairly clear-minded on what is the purpose and the nature of PMBs. PMBs tend to be, and conventionally elsewhere in other jurisdictions, they all tend to be meant to be for private members, backbench members, if you like, although I don't like using that term because I think we're a small organisation. Nevertheless, it is traditionally for those members who are not chairs of committees or ministers and so on. and they tend to be usually much more narrowly focused. Some of our bills are perhaps very complex, as you can see on our books at the minute, the process. And I think that the private members' bills are better been kept on a narrow focus, more narrow than maybe some of the larger bills, because really, I mean, legislation is a complex area of work. As you know, it's very time consuming, takes up a lot of time and effort, takes up a lot of resources, which we'll come to in a moment. So I just think that we would be better if we look at private members' bills, which should traditionally be, wouldn't rule out them having more complex, more lengthy bills, but at the same token, departments are far better placed, have much greater resource at their disposal to take forward complex bills and very significant bills. So, as I say, I think I would tend to look at the PMBs better focusing on more narrow, singular issues, so to speak, which are easier dealt with by members and so on. That also then goes to resources. Clearly, people talk about, and I'm glad and happy to hear members saying that their experience working with Bill's office officials has been very positive. But there is a big resource issue around all of that, and if you look at the costs, I mean, we're going to have spent probably £500,000 within this 2-year mandate to support private members' bills. I mean, that's a lot of money, a lot of public money, and we need to be able to stand over the efficacy of that and the good value for that. And I'm not suggesting for 1 second that it wouldn't be, but resources, it includes, first of all, public finance. It also includes the staff requirements. It also takes up members' times and assembly times. So there's a lot of resources to be able to service this whole process. But I think that one of the things I would like to say as well is that when we're looking at the future legislative programme and what all that entails, I think that we would be wrong in working on the premise of this past 2 years' experience, because this is a very unique couple of years in which we're trying to process legislation. Much greater interest, thankfully, in PMBs. Then you have a tranche of executive legislation as well, and all that's been condensed into a 2-year, more or less, time frame. Whereas we normally look, when we'd like to be thinking about a 5-year mandate, so you can deal with the legislation that we have on our hands at the moment within a 5-year period much better than we can do at the moment. So I think that if you view it from a full mandate, first of all, you're looking at the much longer term to process legislation, but in a way that's not frantic, it's not panicking, it's not really people, adding extra days and all the rest of that into their committees and what have you to do that. So I just think that, but I think that it's very reasonable then that you could also be saying, well, private members' bills should have a time limit to which they can be processed. I think that's quite reasonable, because if you have a 5-year mandate, most members will be coming forward with private members' bills on the basis of their manifesto commitments. So you would assume that they'll be coming very early in the start of the mandate to start to process a private member's bill, whereas the executive legislation generally takes longer to prepare, because obviously ministers are only in place, they're getting to know the departments, get their portfolio, work out with their executive colleagues what their legislative programme is going to be. So that tends to come more later in the mandate, and probably, in fairness, our experience tells us usually quite late in the mandate we get a kind of fairly significant volume of legislation from the executive. So I think it's reasonable then to say, well, you will have a cut-off date, and I would suggest that should be probably at least at 9 months. Insofar as if you're looking at the current period, it would have been reasonable to call a halt to the PMBs. If we had been a normal period, it would have been quite reasonable to have, say, in June past, given the fact that we dissolved the Assembly in March coming, that there's in and around a 9-month period which we could say, well, actually you shouldn't have PMBs been introduced in that period, which would allow then for the volume of executive business to be processed, but not in a frantic or hurried way, and maybe bills coming forward or accelerated passage or within accelerated passage just because we're running out of time, as opposed to there's some other time-sensitive issue in relating to the bill. And that's all just goes to make sure we have proper and appropriate scrutiny. One thing I'd like to address would be what we call the ready drafted bills. And I think we need to be careful that there isn't an unfair advantage conferred on people who are able to get access to a ready drafted bill to bring forward, because that, in effect, allows people using outside organisations. And all this, I'm not suggesting there's any issue around integrity, of course, but what I'm saying is that if a member is able to go to an outside organisation and they produce a bill, and then the member introduces that, well, they go straight to the queue, the top of the queue, so to speak, because they're not using then the normal internal bills office support. And I think you just need to watch that doesn't confer a disadvantage on the main PMBs, given that I say that the PMB legislation or the process should be designed to help the private members, the backbenchers, not people who necessarily have support of bigger organisations behind them, because private PMBs literally are for private members. They're not for parties, they're not for big organisations. So I think we just need to be careful how we do it. I would also say that 3 out of the 7 PMBs which came by way of being ready drafted didn't get through at the first when they brought it to the Speaker's office. They weren't immediately competent, so there had to be a little bit more work done on each of those 3 out of the 7, whereas every other PMB went through at the first count. So the quality control, which Frank talked about earlier on, obviously it pays dividends. So when you do the work through the supported bills office, if you like, the quality is there from day one. It's not necessarily the case with others which are prepared by outside organisations, because sometimes outside organisations have drafted bills for here, but when they bring those bills, they didn't. Maybe some people maybe did like a cut and paste job from legislation elsewhere, but the legislation wasn't always compatible with here, so there had to be a bit of reworking done. Sometimes there were simple things like an oversight. People didn't realise you'd have to go to the Secretary of State to see whether they need the Secretary of State consent and so on. So I'm just saying sometimes it can be a disadvantage using the ready prepared from outside, but sometimes it can also give a disadvantage to those members who have a sponsor from outside to prepare the work for them. In terms of committee membership, I just think that in my role as Speaker, you have to fundamentally guard the impartiality of my role, but not only my role, but in terms of processing legislation. So the Assembly takes its role serious when it's challenging or scrutinising or processing executive legislation. So I think they need to be doing the same thing, have the same principles apply with PMBs. Otherwise, you could end up, and I think John O'Dowd, somebody remarked earlier on in his evidence that, if you're on a committee and you're working with the members, on a day-to-day basis. You've become a very good working relationships, generally speaking, across all of the parties. So you might find that an assembly, if it wasn't careful, it could end up in almost empathetic with the bill because the member is a colleague of yours and you're on your own committee. So I'm not suggesting that you wouldn't have people sponsoring bills on a committee, but I think that should be accidental rather than deliberate. So if you were to make someone an ex officio member, then I think you'd have to consider: are you giving that sponsor member an advantage? I mean, people shouldn't have an advantage. They should have the same equality of opportunity to process their legislation and have their say and to promote that. So I just think I think we need to be careful that we don't give a sponsor of a PMB some type of status which would confer on them a disadvantage. I mean, you wouldn't expect a minister to be able to come into a meeting and a committee meeting and sit there all the time. People would think, well, why would you do that? Well, I think the same question has to be put, well, why would you want to do that for a private member? It still is legislation. At the end of the day, the Assembly has to process that with integrity, has to process it with the same degree of impartiality, if you know. So I think that's important. The last couple of points I would make, just by way of conclusion, obviously our officials have been continuing to learn, and has been a very intense period this period from 2020 has been very, very challenging. We all know that, but I think our officials are still learning and learning well, and I'm glad to hear, as I said earlier on, members thanking the staff and commenting that they have been very, very well supported. I think we are starting to develop a parliamentary culture. I think you can see that. There's more members interested in private legislation. There's more members talking about it. Even some of our local journalists and media commentators are starting to refer to it. I think there's a lack of understanding of what's one stage or second stage or next stage, but all that's kind of technical. But I think the fact that there's a number of private members' bills which have been addressed in recent weeks and months, even in the last days, their media are commenting on it, and I think that's a good thing, because in the end of the day, I always remember that what's the title on above this door here is we are a member of Legislative Assembly. So we are about legislation, and I think because of the stop and start we've had over many, many years, we haven't developed the parliamentary culture and the legislative culture that we probably need to, and I think we're starting to get into that, which is a good thing. So I think there's more members with more experience of it now, more expectations about that, and certainly more interest in looking at it in the future. So I think we can look forward to the fact that we will have much greater interest in PMBs, and we'll have a much greater volume, and I'm very pleased that we, even as we speak, we now have probably more private members' legislation going through the House than we've ever had in any former mandate, including full-term mandates, and I think that's a good thing. And that's something that I would commend our members, the committee staff and the committee members and Assembly members in general for coping with the very unusual circumstances we've had to deal with the past couple of years, but at the same time getting on with business, which isn't always fully acknowledged by some of the wider public commentators. So that would be the last comment I would make, Mr. Chairman, today. As I said, I have presented a paper to the committee for your own consideration outside of the meeting this afternoon, obviously, and I'm happy to address any issue that I've talked about or maybe I've left out, and certainly at any time in the future be more than keen to support the committee in doing your review. So thank you.
Thank you for coming and giving us a clear insight today into the whole process of private members' bills and how you see it from your side of things. And of course, in your paper, you have mentioned about the whole purpose of private members' bill, and the object behind it is to provide good and develop good legislation, and obviously then the whole need that there is to ensure that they're properly scrutinised. Now, I did note you did mention when you were talking there about a cut-off time for private members' bills. However, in the mandate that we're in at this moment in time, we've heard from the Bill Office earlier, where they said that there's 11 that's coming fairly well through. There's another 12 that's on the drafting at the moment. And obviously, at this stage that we're in, all those aren't going to get through. So would it not have been prudent, if you like, to have had a cut-off date in this particular assembly, if you like, to our cut-off date for private members' bills to come through, because we have ones that are going to fall, they're not going to go through, and again there is a cost element associated with that, and perhaps also in that, can you give us some clarity on what stage a private members' bill has to be at to enable it to be picked up in a new mandate from where it left off to be taken on?
Well, in one sense, all legislation falls at the end of a mandate, so it all falls, and it's all equal on that basis. At the same token, if members have already done work to get their bill drafted or to get their bill, consulted on and all the rest of that, all of that's actually quite good to go in the next mandate. So no assembly can then produce a set of bills or half process piece of legislation and expect the next assembly to pick that up, because obviously it'll be new members, it'll be new mandates and all sorts of different dynamics. So you can't bind the incoming assembly to whatever you've done now. But the fact that members will have already done a lot of their work prior to the dissolution, then that means to say then those bills can be much more quickly picked up in the start of the new mandate, because people wouldn't be coming in the door of the new assembly, and obviously new MLAs will do, but members who are already working on bills, they'll already have a fair amount of work done, so you will still have to formally introduce it, not back into the assembly again. But because you've already done a lot of work, front-loaded the work, then you've actually shortened the time frame, which means to say that you wouldn't be sitting another year before you would get any support from the Bills Office. So it would be fairly seamless, if you like, for members in the new mandate to be able to reintroduce legislation.
Given the influx of private members' bills in this short term, do you see that demand continuing into the new mandate and beyond at this same level?
I wouldn't rule out. In fact, I think it's fairly sure to say that you will have a greater interest, because now that people are seeing that you can actually get this stuff done. I mean, private members have already had some of their bills in second stage and so on, and that means they're able to go out and say, well, they already have legislation in the process and it's already been debated. And again, I think that's helping to create an overall environment where people are expecting members to be producing legislation here. So I think, yes, you will get greater interest in the next mandate, and probably that will continue. But there will always be finite resources, because in the end of the day, an assembly then might have to consider, I mean, this committee might have to then consider further restrictions, further type of restrictions, or there may be ballots, or there may be, I mean, there are systems elsewhere, and I'm not advocating any of those. What I'm saying is that at the experience that we have thus far, we know there will be and can expect a greater interest from a wider number of members to bring forward private legislation. So I do think it's realistic in that context. You have to still say there's a finite resource here. There's only a certain amount of money that the Assembly can justifiably spend. There's also the recognition that people only have a certain amount of time to give as well. So, you know, the system is already fairly busy. The committees sit on Wednesdays and Thursdays. The Assembly sits on Mondays and Tuesdays. So there's the financial resource required. There's also the time of the members and the Assembly system itself to be able to cope with all that. So depending on the volume that you might get, then I think you'll have to find ways of then reducing the amount of legislation. But I think that'd be a good complaint to have, actually. But remember that we already do have standing orders which allow the Business Committee and committees to actually look at the legislation they have in front of them and work out what they can realistically deal with. And I think just for our purpose, we just need to make sure we find criteria for doing that, rather than simply saying, oh, we like that bill or we don't like that one. So we need to make sure we prevent any, if you like, partial reason for, or partisan reason for, you know, saying we can't deal with that bill, we can't deal with that bill. Equally, people shouldn't be able to say that, well, I don't like that bill, or we'll deal with that bill because it only has 2 clauses. Those 2 clauses could be very, very, very contentious and could be quite significant and complex. As we have known, sometimes one clause out of a bill of 10 could be the substance of the bill. So I just think that, yes, you will get more interest, and I do think that at some point in the next mandate, the Assembly probably would then need to look, well, how will they then actually then filter out bills that they think, well, realistically, that's not going to get the chance to be processed, and let's not waste any public money on that. But I think that's a discussion for another day, actually, in the new mandate.
Okay, thank you. Anyone indicate, Joanne?
Yes, Chairman, if I may, Mr. Speaker, thanks very much for your evidence and your paper. Just with regard, the points in your paper that really struck me were paragraphs 11, 12 and 13. With regard to the definition of a PMB, how you see a PMB and the financial responsibility contained therein. If you don't mind, I'd like to get your views on a couple of points. There are 2 bills at present. We're dealing with 2 bills on exactly the same thing, both of which are a massive issue. I mean, do you have views on that? Should there be a private member's bill on the same issue when the department is bringing forward a bill on that subject?
Well, I want to make sure in my role as Speaker that I'm not seen to be straying into, you know, it's been seen to be in favour of one issue or another, or one bill.
Purely dealing with principle.
But there's 2 things that strike me and all that. Well, first of all, the PMB came in because there wasn't, I mean, as you know yourself, when people are asked to develop their PMB, they're asked to go and talk to the department and to check out, because one of the criteria we have to look at is there an alternative way of dealing with the legislation that the private member is advocating. But if the private member comes back and says to us that they can't get a commitment from, for example, the department or a minister, that they're going to produce similar legislation, well, then they're free then to table that, and the Speaker's office, as we speak, has no role to say, well, actually, we're not going to take that. So once it's eligible to be put forward, then we have to take that and process it. We're now facing 2 bills, and you're right, there are 2 bills on the one kind of general topic, and both will be very complex. It's probably it probably would have been better had you had one bill but the scope was there and the facility was there for the sponsor of the PMB and the department to go off and haggle and try and sort that out. If they're unable to do that, then the Assembly will process both bills in parallel. And actually, I'm not that overly concerned about the complexity of that, because I think that there will come a point in time whenever one bill is in front of the House and clauses are being voted on or voted down or voted in, and that will determine what happens to the next bill. So it's entirely in the hands of the members, actually. I don't see it as complicated, or I've heard some people just saying they were horrified, or I can't remember the terminology, but people seem to be, I thought, inflating the difficulty around that. It's legislation. I mean, whenever a single bill comes forward to the House, and members here will have been involved in a number of those, and what have been maybe complex and even sometimes contentious bills, and then you get amendments and counter arguments. So the members are able to deal with that and are able to take their decisions on that quite easily. I mean, it might be with difficulty and great passion and all the rest of that, but members are able to process legislation here, and I think they've proved that well, including, as I say, in recent times, where we have produced with legislation some very difficult issues, and members of both committees have managed to navigate their way through that quite, in my view, maturely politically as well. So I think it's better if you had one bill on the same topic. Yes, I think at all times. And as I say, the facilities are in there where people want to sponsor a bill needs to make sure they're able to tell us that they don't have a commitment for another one by someone else, a department, for example. But when that doesn't happen, then we have to deal with it and process it. But what I'm saying is we can do that. I believe, and I'm confident about that.
I think that's fair enough. I suppose that's about the strength of the processes. And obviously, engagement between the department and the sponsor is absolutely key in all of this. But so is scope. And it seems to me there are some private members' bills on the table, and primarily the bills that have come through the Assembly since its inception, and private members' bills have been niche, narrow in focus, and addressing a gap in legislation. Certainly, we've expressed a preference, my party's expressed a preference that things beyond that maybe are probably more suited to a department with all the resources that the department brings. And you have mentioned some of that in your paper. But we have had members give evidence to us suggesting that the resources available to ministers and departments should be equally available to members bringing a private member's bill. Do you have views on that?
Well, I think the people need to go back to our current roots. Our primary responsibility is to hold to account the executive and so on, and to process executive legislation. That's our primary function. We also have then a role for PMBs and helping to shape policy and so on and so forth, and develop all of that. So I think it makes sense that the larger, big, complex issues are best suited by a department, because for the obvious reason that they have a lot more capacity to develop and propose and to pursue very substantial and complex legislation. As I've said earlier on this afternoon, I mean, PMBs, generally speaking, are seen to be the reserve of backbenchers. Again, I don't like that term, but nevertheless, it's kind of commonly referred to. But private members' bills, there is a role for that. But and all legislation is very, very important, and it has to be handled in a very professional and mature way. But our primary role is to work with the executive to scrutinise their legislation and hold that executive to account for how they do their work and all the rest of that. So it makes sense for me that on a range of issues, for a range of reasons, why PMB should be for more niche, more narrow. I wouldn't rule out, private members and having some capacity for bigger bills, but I just think it kind of goes against the grain of what PMBs are, generally speaking, perceived to be about. There is also then the resources required for PMBs. And at the end of the day, if we treat all legislation the same, we will still make high standard requirements of members to produce PMBs. And then you have to ask yourself, well, how many private members have the capacity to deal with, process big complex bills. I mean, how many members can do that unless they've been well supported by outside organisations and whatever you have, and then or even your party? And so therefore, does that give some members more advantage than others? Because I think this is all about fairness, if you like, and fair treatment. It also means to say that if a private member is in the queue and getting support from the Bills Office, and it's a very long and complex bill, there's a lot of time and resource and finance to support that one member. Does that then mean then you disadvantage 5 other members or 6 other members because they're not going to be able to get that same resource and time because somebody's going to run out of time on those PMBs? So I think there's a question of fairness that's just to be addressed and all that, and also capacity. Because I say it's a big commitment for any legislation to go through by any private member, but then expect that private member to be able to produce a very complex bill, then to get the extra support, which costs money, which takes staff time, takes a member's time, takes committee time and all the rest of that. So I just think that we should be safer looking at PMBs as for more narrowly focused type of legislation.
Mr. Speaker, then just with regard to paragraph 13, which is about financial responsibility on sponsors of private members' bills, some members kind of take the view that, well, they will come forward with a proposal, they'll get it to a certain point, and ultimately, whatever the Assembly decides, the Minister will have to live with. And members are perfectly entitled to take that view, and the Minister may have to live with it if it passes. But you have indicated that you think there should be consideration of the financial implications of a bill for the whole, because obviously they could be significant to a department's budget. Do you want to elaborate any more on your thoughts around that, please?
Well, I think when you look at institutions, parliaments elsewhere across the board, there is a specific role for PMBs and backbench MPs and members of various political institutions, parliaments and so on, even the Dáil Éireann. When you look at the process there, I think people just need to be bearing in mind that, as I've said earlier on, we haven't fully developed our parliamentary culture yet. So an executive department is expected to say, this is the kind of cost of this bill that they're putting forward and all the rest of that. They have to outline the implications and the benefits and so on, and costs associated with that. So an executive department will be expected to do work with the Department of Finance to get some costings around. I just think that it would be foolish if we were not to be also able to say to ourselves here, when we believe that we're going to have an increase of interest of members to bring forward private members' legislation, that you can't ignore then there being perhaps an accumulative cost associated with all of that. So I think it's reasonable then that we should have some understanding that people bringing forward private members' bills should also be bringing forward some costs attached to that, just so that people can understand, well, where does all this end? If you know what I mean. I think the efficacy of a legislative programme is people should know what the implications are, including the totality of that.
Even if they don't have access to the same information that obviously the Department will have?
Well, they can engage with the Department of Finance, whether or not to get the degree of information or cooperation that they want. I'm not so sure. I don't want to speculate on that at all. But I do think that we should say to people there should be some onus on people to be when they're bringing forward legislation, because legislation is binding and it's very, very important, and it's up to members to pass whatever legislation they deem fit. But at the same token, whereas it has policy outcomes, we also need to look at the financial outcomes. I think it's reasonable to ask people, well, you should be drawing attention to that as well. And I think it's quite reasonable and rational, and happens elsewhere.
Chairman, I'm almost on just one more, which is with regard to, Mr. Speaker, we're looking at whether or not there should be a threshold of support for a private member's bill before it progresses. Do you have views on that?
I think given the nature of our institution, that may be difficult to square that circle, because you would not want to be accused of saying, well, a bigger party is able to, put a sway. Now, I believe that you take away the ministers and all the rest of that, and you're down to 80 or whatever it is, or 75 members. So potentially all of those members are private members. they're as entitled to bring forward legislation as someone else. But I think if we're going to get into a way, if we want to say, well, there's a threshold, well, how does that accommodate smaller parties or independent members who are equally entitled to bring forward legislation as a big party would be? So I think we would need to be very conscious of the danger of that if you want to go down that road.
Okay, Joanne. Nicola?
Thanks, Deputy Chair, and thanks, Ken Corla. It's great to have you here within the committee and to have your expertise. I think that's really important for us going forward with this review, so thank you for taking the time to do that. I think you make some really valid points. There's one issue I just wanted to ask you about. You talked about bills coming through to your office already drafted and how they can have an advantage and disadvantages. And you may have heard Colin McGrath giving evidence earlier on in this committee as well. And we discussed kind of issues that potentially could happen with lobbies, I suppose, from outside organisations coming in. Colin did say he hadn't experienced it, and nobody has, but just there's that potential. And you made the point that 3 out of the 7 private members' bills that went through the Assembly in this mandate, 3 of them didn't go through initially because they didn't meet the quality checks or criteria. So given that, and given the fact there are advantages and disadvantages, do you think it's still fair to accept both routes? So bills that can be drafted externally and then bills that can be drafted through the Bills Office?
Yes, I mean, I don't rule. I wouldn't be ruling them out. I'm just simply saying is there are some things that you can build in within a framework which everybody understands and are clear about and are within the standing orders and so on. I think you can build in protections to make sure that nobody is advantaged or disadvantaged. That's all I'd be saying, because all members, private members, are all entitled to bring forward legislation, but we need to make sure everybody's treated on an equal basis. So if you want to bring in, if you want to get support from an outside organisation, I know Colin mentioned earlier on, referred to potential down the line for vested interests and so on and so forth. Yes, you can get all that, and I think in the longer run, we would just need to make sure, because hopefully the Assembly runs on for a number of years and on into the next several years, and we develop our continuing parliamentary culture. But what I recognise is that in the early days of the Assembly from 1998 onwards, there were a number of organisations which came together as lobbyists, and that's all very, very fine and appropriate and fair. But we've seen how that evolved in other institutions over the years, periodically, not all the time, where things just got probably out of hand, and organisations stopped being lobbyists and became something else. So I just think, for me, it's all about just making sure that, first of all, there's 2 things. There's efficiency. So I've just drew attention to the fact that 3 out of 7 bills didn't go through here in the first instance. Most of that was just technical issues. There was nothing major wrong with the policy. Some of it was a bit of drafting issue. Some of it was to do with people thinking you could lift a piece of legislation from Scotland or somewhere else and just transpose it here. It didn't just work. Some things that are around, as I said earlier on, talking to like the Secretary of State to see whether the bill might need consent or whatever. So it was like sort of dotting the I's, crossing the T's, so to speak, with those. I just drew attention to that, the fact that all the ones that went through the Bills support here, Bills Office support here, went through straight away without any glitches, because they were dealing with the internal expertise that we had at hand. So I wouldn't be ruling out like ready drafted bills, but I would just think we need to make sure we have rules and regulations in place to make sure that people aren't disadvantaged because of that. So that's what I would just draw attention to.
Okay, thanks for that. I totally agree with that there point, and I suppose that's something we'll reflect in our review, just to have built-in protections. I think that's the important bit. Just one final point. You'd mentioned about it costing about £500,000 in the last 2 years for these PMBs to go through. In order for that to be like money well spent, do you think there should be an additional plenary day to ensure that the PMBs can be taken forward before the end of the mandate?
Well, I think it's wise or prudent for the Assembly to give itself flexibility in these matters, because there may be times when you don't have a rush of legislation at that particular time, so you may have set yourself days that you might then need to cancel, and that doesn't have a good look, and it's not the wisest use of your time management. So I think that the Assembly, as I've said earlier on, in the context of this 2 years, at the minute we are condensing a lot in a short period of time, both in terms of executive legislation and private members, and all the other business that we're doing with the pandemic, not least, which has taken up a lot of time and effort in the institution. So I think that if we look at it in the round from a 5-year mandate perspective, then all of this could be managed much easier and less frantically. So the need for extra days may not always be as pressing. We have the availability to use it. I mean, it's there for us if we want to use that. We can roll over in the Wednesday mornings now as we speak without any second thought on that. If you get into a process next year or within the next couple of years or within the next mandate, I think it's within the next mandate you'd probably want to reflect on that question better, whether we need to set aside a different time. I mean, like at one point I would have liked to see the Assembly doing plenary days on Tuesdays and Wednesdays rather than Monday and Tuesday, because I know that members, both officials, members and the member staff, are working Sundays as well to try to prepare for Monday. And I just don't think that that's kind of compatible with family-friendly hours or even people normal working hours. I think it's a bit of a burden. So I think we can always look at how we do our business more efficiently. I think at the moment, I think we could wait until the next mandate before we look at whether we need to dedicate days or so on for a particular piece of legislation or not.
I think that's a really important point you make there, actually, about maybe changing the days. Absolutely, Sunday is often taken up with preparation for Monday. But listen, thanks very much for that, Corla, and thank you, Deputy Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. Cara?
Thank you, Deputy Chair. Speaker, you've definitely given us all food for thought, particularly around the purpose of a private member's bill, how it goes through, the resources required, and what kind of something that kind of hit hard was the equality of opportunity also for members. And bringing forward a private member's bill, particularly regarding external support that might be available for some and not for others and stuff. So definitely food for thought. So I just want to pick your brains, and obviously James and Frank also mentioned, experiences elsewhere. So from counterparts and other legislators in relation to private members' bills, is there anything that inspires you or anything do you foresee that the Assembly could consider taking forward?
By way of legislation, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I'll not venture into that territory because, I have to remain genuinely impartial. So when a bill comes to my office for competence and so on and so forth, then I don't look at the party. I'm blind to the party. I'm blind to the policy intent. I have to make sure that it's compatible, it's compliant, and so on. So you'll forgive me if I don't enter into speculating what might be a good piece of legislation to bring forward.
Okay.
Then I might bring my own personal interest to bear on that one.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Cara, and thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, the only last point I would make is, because it has come up earlier on, and I would have been asked normally, and very professionally, the officials would have been saying to me early on in the year that you would need to draw the curtain down on PMBs because for all the arguments like you're going to be spending money on this or you're going to be cramming the system, I certainly felt that it was not time, come back to June and even into September, that I felt that we are a legislative assembly, that we had been bedeviled by the pandemic. There was legislation in the queue. I had no way of knowing what volume of executive legislation, for example, that we were going to eventually get. I was hopeful, like everybody else, that we get what the executive wanted to do, produce and process. So I didn't want, and I was determined not to pull the curtain down on the ability of private members to bring forward legislation when there would have been time to process that. And I think that's been proven right because, yes, it's very busy at the moment. We'll have less than probably 3 months assembly time now to process the rest of it. we will produce more legislation than in any previous mandate. I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing that this Assembly can not rest its case and not be in any way complacent at all, but to say to people out there, we are now doing what we are supposed to be doing, which is processing legislation. And as I say, I think that's a good thing. But what I'm saying is I took those decisions to continue to leave open and to extend the deadlines for people to be able to bring these things forward in the context that we still had some time left. But I'd be very clear that when you're looking at a 5-year mandate ahead of you, we can regulate it much easier without the frantic nature of committees having to do 3 or 4 committee bills at the same time and do an extra day sitting. So we have to avoid that in the future. But as I say, I don't have any compunction of against doing what we did by leaving the books open to allow more legislation to come forward.
Yeah, well, I suppose it shows you what can be done whenever the will's there to do it. But again, thank you for taking the time and coming and giving us of your evidence today. Very, very much appreciated. And again, we thank you just for attending the committee.
Thank you, Deputy Chairman. Thank you, members. Thank you.
I ask the members if they have any further comments relating to today's proceedings. Members, today concludes the oral evidence session that the committee have scheduled for this inquiry, and if I can turn your attention to page 24 of your pack, this is a table of the written and oral evidence that we have received to date, and of course Hansard from today will be added, and any other evidence received will be added to that. Is committee content to consider the draft options in an early draft of the inquiry report at the next committee meeting in closed session? Committee will be aware that it is standard practice to consider contents of a committee inquiry report in closed session before a report is made public by the committee. And members agreed on that way forward.
Yeah, okay. Chairman, can I make one proposal, please? And it's this. Previously, we had sought evidence from the executive with regard to private members' bills, and it wasn't forthcoming. And that may well be because the executive has to act as a collective and a corporate body. But that's not to say that ministers don't have important and valid views that could inform this inquiry. And just because the executive maybe couldn't come to a collective response doesn't mean there aren't things that we should hear. And I'm wondering about the merits of actually writing to each of the ministers to say, look, is there anything that you would like us to bear in mind as we consider this report and consider changes to the process? Because each of them may well have different thoughts, and just because they can't agree on a position doesn't mean that those thoughts and views won't really help us as we progress the inquiry.
Yeah. Okay, members agreed that the clerk write to the individual ministers and asked for their views on this particular inquiry.
Yeah.
All agreed?
Yes.
Emer?
Yep. Happy to take that note. Yeah.
Thank you for that, folk. Agenda item 8, members, in your packs at page 56 is a forward work programme for January 22 to March 22, and as you can see we have plenty of items that needs consideration and discussion before the end of the mandate. Do members have any comments to make on this particular programme? And therefore, are members content that we'll move forward with the work programme? All agreed? Thank you.
Yes.
There are a couple of items of correspondence. Page 60 is a memo from the Clerking and Member Support Office regarding a member development programme on deaf awareness. And whilst this training is primarily aimed at members, spaces will also be available to party support staff, and any member or party support member that wishes to sign up to the programme is asked to book a place via email to the CAMS office. So that's there in your packs for you. And also at page 62 is the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission newsletter. Our committee condemned to note these issues. Do members have any other business? Well then, folk, the date and time of the next meeting will be Wednesday, the 19th of January 2022 at 2:30 p.m. But can I ask members to not to be going off here, because we have we're moving into closed session, to look at legal advice for in regards to the official opposition. So we'd ask members to remain with us, please, if at all possible.
I'll confirm with you just when we get the confirmation we're in closed session. And press the red.
29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Committee Room 29.